Well, welcome to everybody joining us out there on Facebook. We thank you for being with us tonight. It is actually not our normal Tuesday night Bible study. It is our special service of Shavuot tonight, so we thank you for joining us. And before we start, we are going to begin with the sounding of the shofars. Well, we're going to get right into it tonight. Like I said, this is Shavuot. It's starting this evening and going through tomorrow. Tomorrow is a Sabbath day for us. So we're just going to jump right into the Word. So it's customary on Shavuot to, in all the synagogues and stuff, they read the book of Ruth. And we actually haven't done this for quite some time. We're not reading the entire book of Ruth tonight, although we could. It's only 4 chapters. But we're going to primarily focus on the first chapter and kind of pick through the rest of it. So let's turn to the book of Ruth in chapter 1. And so we're going to go on a journey with Ruth and Naomi, and you're going to see how the journey with Ruth and Naomi, the relationship that the two of them had, lines right up with what Shavuot is about, and about what our relationship is and how it's supposed to be with Yeshua. So Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 1, says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem of Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he, his wife, and his 2 sons. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and his 2 sons were named Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem of Judah. They went to the country of Moab and continued there. But Elimelech, who was Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They dwelt there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, so the woman was bereft of her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in Moab how the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she left the place where she was, her 2 daughter-in-laws with her, and they started on the way back to Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find a home and rest, each in the house of her husband.' Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband tonight and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it is far more bitter for me than for you that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.' Then they wept aloud again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, 'See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law.' And Ruth said, 'Urge me not to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death departs me from you.' When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more. So they both went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred about them and said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So the verses that I'm going to focus on tonight are back in, starting with verse 14. We're going to look through at verse 14 through 18 again, actually. But this account of Ruth and the whole story of Ruth and everything, this account of Ruth shows the willingness, devotion, and commitment on her part to leave what was comfortable, to leave what was familiar to her, to follow after Naomi. Now think of this. Naomi is saying to both of them, go back, return to your mother's house. So, there were on both of the daughters-in-law, it was their family. It was what they have always known. It was their life and stuff. It was everything that was familiar and comfortable to them. And one daughter-in-law made a choice to return, but Ruth didn't. And as we go along, we'll see that she didn't out of this deep commitment to Naomi, out of this deep submission to her, so to speak, this willingness. She was willing to give up everything that was, so to speak, important to her. Everything, family, friends, who else knows what her life was all about. But she was willing to give up all of that to follow after the one who had the answers, who had the wisdom, who ultimately was able to bring her to the fulfillment of her destiny. And she followed hard after her. In tradition, Ruth was actually a princess in the land of Moab. She was a Moabite princess. So she came from wealth. She came from affluence. She came from a background of basically having everything she could want or need. And she was willing to lay all that down as well to go along with Naomi. Naomi came back, we read it in the last few verses of the chapter, that Naomi came back not in good spirits, to say the least. She was not in a very good place, and she had lost a lot. And so for Ruth to choose to side with her still, to choose to stay with her still, she really was giving everything up to follow her. So we see in this story with Ruth how much it's tied to Shavuot. We know that Shavuot was about revelation. It's about the giving of the word at Mount Sinai. We talked about some of this stuff on Sabbath. It was given of the word at Mount Sinai, and then in the New Testament, given of the Spirit. But it's also about entering into a covenant with Yahweh. So when you look at Ruth and Naomi, they are a type and shadow of us in Yeshua. How you see Ruth walking out with Naomi is how we're supposed to be walking with Yeshua. That same commitment, that same willingness, that same devotion. How many of us have left that which was familiar, that which was comfortable? I know, like for Scott and I, when we were first asked, when are you moving down here? And it was like, why would we move down here? Our life was in Nashua. We owned a house. Our family was there. Our jobs were there. Everything, our lives were there. But then came the revelation. It was like, okay, it's time. And for us to leave what was familiar, leave what was comfortable, especially for Scott. Nashua was his entire life from the time he was like 8 years old. That's all he knew. And that's what was comfortable and familiar to him. But it was a giant leap and step of faith for both of us to take that move and come down here, just like what Ruth did with Naomi, because we knew there was something more. Because we knew that there was a different home that we belonged to, just like with Ruth. So Ruth and Naomi are a type and shadow of us with Yeshua, leaving behind what is comfortable and familiar to follow after Yeshua wholeheartedly. Just as Ruth was willing to follow after Naomi wholeheartedly, that's how it's supposed to be with us. When Yahweh gave the words to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, it was a forming of a covenant. It was a forming for them to make that choice to follow after him wholeheartedly, no matter what. Ruth's words to Naomi revealed a heart commitment to her that created a covenant. So, look back when Yahweh gave those words. Yahweh's words to the Israelites, but in essence, Yahweh's words to us at Mount Sinai revealed a heart commitment on his part for us to create a covenant. Just like in a marriage. You look at a marriage and we talk so much about how it's a covenant, how, you enter a marriage contract. Now, what do we know once you enter into marriage contracts and once you make a covenant? They're not meant to be broken. Back in those days, if somebody entered into covenant with someone else, it was a very, very serious thing. It was a commitment that was meant to have forever. And you weren't to break that covenant. And if you were to break that covenant, it actually meant death to you if you broke that covenant. But when people got into covenant with each other, it was what is mine is yours and yours is mine, whatever it is. I've got your back, you've got mine. That's a real covenant. And you see that with Ruth towards Naomi. It's, I will be with you no matter what. So when you go back and you look at the verses starting at 14, and the one daughter-in-law leaves, and it says, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth clung to her. So in essence, when you look at the definition of the word clung, it means to hold on tightly to, remain very close to, adhere or stick firmly or closely to, be hard to part or remove from. That's Ruth's actions towards Naomi. And, get the picture. She's like, clinging on to her, you're not going to let go. And she was adhered to Naomi. It was actually kind of, if you think about it, the first step as part of the covenant. Because what happens when the husband and wife get married? They become one. They're adhered and stuck together. You can't break that apart. And so with Ruth towards Naomi, she was clung to her. She stuck to her, she was adhered to her, and you could not remove her from Naomi. That's how we're supposed to be with Yahweh. That you cannot remove us from Yahweh. It's like super glue or that gorilla glue. I hear gorilla glue is a little bit more stronger, but you're so clung, you're so stuck to that nothing can part that. Nothing can separate that. So Ruth clung to her. And then we see, Naomi says, see your sister-in-laws go back. Naomi is trying to convince her, go back. So, Ruth is hearing this, and Naomi is saying to just go back, return to your mother's house, return to your peoples. She's trying to persuade Ruth, return.
She's trying to get her to do an opposite of teshuvah.
Exactly.
Basically, she's trying to get her to return away from God.
Exactly.
Which isn't how we should be influencing anybody.
So verse 16, and Ruth says, urge me not to leave you or to turn back from following you. Now, when Yahweh spoke those words at Sinai, and he gave us his word, those were words that were binding. As I read these following verses, what Ruth said to Naomi, those words were binding. Those words were meant to be set and sown, and that's what applies to us. These same words, as he spoke, the words that he spoke to us at Mount Sinai, we're supposed to be like Ruth, saying this back to him. And she says, urge me not to leave you or to turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go. Well, we're supposed to say to him, for where you go, I will go. She said, and where you lodge, I will lodge. We're supposed to say to him, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. We have said in this congregation that your people are our people, and you are our God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Interesting, in one of the translations I was looking at last night, I actually think it was paraphrase. It was the Passion paraphrase. When you read that part where it says, she said, where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The paraphrase actually goes on a little bit further to say, and there will I be buried right next to you. Now think of that. Not just in life, but also in death. Not just on this natural realm, but for all of eternity. I am saying to you, I am declaring to you that I will be with you for eternity. That even when I die, I will be right next to you.
You know, you compare that to the Apostle Paul's words in Romans, where he talks about how what shall separate us from the love of God? Neither height nor depth nor anything in creation, nor life nor death, anything. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. That's that cleaving. That's that clinging to that covenant language that just the same as Ruth said to Naomi.
So where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. So I kind of got a little ahead of myself here, but there's 3 key words that I'm looking at in this declaration that Ruth has made to Naomi. And it's really 3 key words that we got to put in our lives with our declaration to Yahweh, because these 3 words he declared to us. And that first word I already said was clung. The second word, or words, 3 words that she said, was urge me not. It's that word urge. So urge means, now she's saying urge me not. Now when you just look at the word urge, it says try earnestly or persistently to persuade to do something. So in essence, she's saying to Naomi, do not persistently try to persuade me to leave you. Do not urge me, because I am not going to leave you. And then she says in verse 18, when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more. The word determined means having made a firm decision decision and being resolved not to change it. So Ruth was determined. You know, here it is. You would think, you know, she has Naomi, and it's her mother-in-law, and she's an older individual than her. And the tendency, I had read actually somewhere where somebody was saying, the commentary on it was like, you know, was Ruth being a little disrespectful to Naomi? You know, normally you submit to your elders, and when they tell you to do something, you do it. She was doing something that Naomi was telling her to do, but you don't see it fulfilled until we get later on in the story. And so with that word determined, you know, she was making that firm decision and being resolved that she wasn't going to change it. No matter what Naomi was saying to her, no matter how much Naomi was trying to persuade her, go back to your mother, go back to your mother.
It's like Elijah and Elisha.
Yeah, right. It's like Elijah and Elisha. It's no matter what. It's no matter what was being said to Ruth, she was not going to move. She was going to keep her commitment. And in other words, she's saying to Naomi, I'm with you to the end. You know, I'm with you no matter what. We're in this until the race is over. And this is how we're supposed to be with Yahweh. You know, Ruth had such laser focus on Naomi. You know, to decree words like these aren't normal words you just declare to anybody. Okay? These aren't words that you would decree to, you know, your acquaintance at work. Okay? These are words that once spoken, not only did Naomi hear the words, not only did Yahweh hear the words, but the devil heard the words. And when he hears you make such a solid commitment, and now Ruth is ultimately joined to Naomi as one, there's power in that. But the other thing that we see about Ruth is Ruth did everything that Naomi told her to do. You know, as you read further into the account of the story of Ruth, and how do we know that? Because in chapter 3 at verse 5, she says, you know, Naomi is giving her instructions about Boaz. This is how you're to do it. And there's specific instructions. You know, we talk about how Yahweh is a God of detail, and it's, you know, do this, you know, and then make it 3 cubits or whatever, you know. He's a God of detail. Well, the instructions that Naomi gave Ruth on certain things was detailed, because she knew it had to be ever so precisely laid out in order for Ruth to have manifested what they were believing for. But we know that Ruth did everything that Naomi told her to do, because she responds back to Naomi in verse 5. And Ruth said to her, all that you say to me, I will do. That shows even further the strength of the covenant. After Ruth goes through this whole thing of saying, these vows, in essence, that's what it is. Ruth was saying vows to Naomi. Just like when you hear a husband and wife and getting married, that husband and wife, they say vows to each other, certain vows. And those vows are meant to be for eternity. They're meant to be long lasting. They're meant to birth the commitment and the covenant that binds them together as one. Well, that's how it is with Ruth and Naomi. So Ruth did everything Naomi told her. She didn't complain. She didn't question. She was fully submitted and obedient to Naomi. And when you look at this, and I was thinking of this the other night, when you look at Ruth and how, she had somebody telling her what to do every step of the way. A lot of people, they have an issue with that. Okay, a lot of people, they buck up against, wait a minute, you're telling me what to do? And who are you to tell me what to do? Okay, but when it comes down to a true heart relationship, as it was with Ruth to Naomi, Ruth knew that Naomi possessed the keys to carry her into her destiny. Just how we need to know that Yahweh possesses the keys to carry us into our destiny. So like we've said before, whenever he tells us to do something, we do it. No matter, I'm sure there were times when Ruth was like, I don't understand why I'm doing that. I don't quite get why you're telling me to lay there, okay? But you said it, I'm going to do it. And the question we need to ask ourselves, especially during this Shavuot, coming in through tonight and into tomorrow when we're spending time in the Word and stuff, are we that way with Yahweh? Are we Ruths? Seriously, you got to ask that question to yourself. Am I like Ruth? Would I say these words? It's one thing to say words. It's a whole other thing when you back the words up with action. And it's very clear in the book of Ruth that Ruth backed up her words with actions every step of the way. But the important question to ask yourself during this time of Shavuot is, am I like Ruth? Will I be like Ruth? Am I this way with Yahweh? When I say to him, for where you go, I will go, do I mean it? Do its heart? And I'm going to back that up with actions. Interesting, it made me think of like the story of the wedding feast in Cana. And, they're at the feast and stuff, and we know the story. They run out of wine and everything, and Mary turns to Yeshua and says to him, my paraphrase, you're going to do anything about this? And he's like, woman, it's not my time. My time has not yet come, okay? But what does she do? She turns to the servants and says, whatever he says to you to do, do it. Whatever he says to do, do it. Just like how the attitude Ruth had. Whatever Naomi said to her to do, she was going to do it. When Mary said that to Yeshua, to the servants about Yeshua, whatever he says to you to do, do it. And that's how we're supposed to be. Whatever he says to us to do, we do it. Now we know in the story of the wedding, they witnessed an amazing miracle. Well, we know in the story of Ruth and Naomi, we see how this entire miracle played out, and the destiny of Naomi was fulfilled. For Ruth was fulfilled by meeting their kinsman redeemer, but her making covenant with the kinsman redeemer. And that's kind of a whole other sermon, whole other rabbit trail we can get down. But that's the question that I wanted to present tonight, was, are you like Ruth? Are you willing to leave everything to follow after Yeshua wholeheartedly? It makes me think so often of Chosen. And I won't say anything about season 4. I know, it's not going there, okay? There was 3 previous seasons, okay? But, you look at the disciples, and they left things to follow after Yeshua. They left a lot to follow after Yeshua. None of us have been in that position, so to speak, like the disciples were, with what they left to follow after Yeshua. But would we? Would we? And so that's what the decision, that's what we got to examine, especially during this time right now of Shavuot. Are we willing to follow wholeheartedly after him? Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. And like I said, we've already declared and made that very strong in here that his people are our people. But when it comes to Shavuot and the story of Ruth and Naomi, we got to look at the willingness and the obedience and the submission on Ruth's part to leave everything that was familiar, to leave everything that was comfortable, to follow after the one who was going to carry her into her destiny.
Everything that Ruth did, she did unselfishly. She did very little for herself. I mean, you think of it. Many people say that Boaz was an old man. He was certainly a lot older than she was. Here she is, a Moabite princess in the prime of her life, could have gone back to her own land and had probably the pick of young men in her land. But she leaves it all, not thinking that Boaz is going to show up. There's no thought of that. That's not why she left. But when Naomi says Boaz is the kinsman redeemer and you've got to go through this plan that I have and trust me, Ruth left behind whatever ideas she might have had, whatever dreams she might have had. She laid it all down to obey Naomi. And what a blessing she ended up gaining from it. What an amazing blessing. More than she ever could even in the natural have received. So you got to understand, it's the fact that Ruth was a Moabite woman. Deuteronomy 23:3 talks about how none of the Moabites may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. She was shut out of any potential of ever being part of Israel in the natural. She had no chance. There's no chance of her ever, or any of her descendants, anyone of the Moabite family. None of them could enter the assembly of the Lord. But because she had so much faith, her faith was a lot like the Canaanite woman that came to Yeshua asking for healing for her daughter. And he said to her, it's not right that you should take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. So he basically called this woman a dog. But she didn't get offended, and she didn't say, who does he think he is calling me a dog? She stood on a faith that made no sense, a faith that overcame the natural odds, and yes, even overrode the natural law of the Torah that said that you have nothing. You're without God. There's no hope for you. She stood on a faith that transcended time and reached beyond the veil of Yeshua's sacrifice and took something from the future that wasn't even hers to take, but by faith she accessed it. It's the same with Ruth. She, by her faithful obedience to Naomi, and it's interesting because as it progresses, and you have the whole thing where Naomi tells her to go to the threshing floor. Now, that in and of itself is significant. That's a whole other message. You go to the threshing floor. What is a threshing floor? Where you strip off the chaff from the wheat, where you strip off or barley, because this is at the time of the barley harvest, where you strip off the outer casings and anything that is not usable to the purpose, the intended purpose. So she had to go to the threshing floor first before she could be used by Yahweh. She laid herself down next to Boaz. That was an act of submission. There on the threshing floor, she was laying herself down and saying, you know what? I have no right to ask this. In the natural, I have nothing. But her prayer, her request to him was, spread your wings over me, for you are my Redeemer. That right there is where her faith lay in. That's such a powerful thing. And just like Ruth, we've got to come to the point where we say that to Yahweh. We might be, Ruth came to the threshing floor as a forbidden outcast. No chance of being part of the people of Israel. She had no idea if she could even be married to by a Jewish man. But she came to lay claim to the redeeming love of God. And isn't it so interesting that the story of Ruth is central to the entire celebration of Shavuot, which is the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai? You know, the Jewish tradition says that all nations stood at the foot of the mountain. But the Jewish nation is the one that said, we will hear and we will obey. We will do what you say. We receive your commandments. And they accepted it. Well, at that mountain, the covenant was made. The covenant was sealed. The covenant was sealed with the Jewish people, but there was already the opening for those of us to be grafted in. You know, once you come to the new covenant, you have the giving of Holy Spirit on the day of Shavuot. Once again, here comes Holy Spirit infilling the believers, and he's spreading out to the Gentiles. And you know, it's that whole picture where Paul says that you who were once far off have now been brought near. You had no hope. You were without God in the world. But now. And it's the but now of Shavuot that gives us the hope. You know, the fact that when Ruth and Naomi came to Bethlehem, they came at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's Shavuot. So she was the picture of the very receiving of the Torah. She's the image of everything that we want to be. The one that comes from the outside but is so hungry, so wants God, so wants to follow God that you're willing to give it all up and cleave to him, to cling to him. You know, she was one who made the ultimate teshuvah. And her teshuvah obviously was accepted, you know, even though the Torah said that she could never stand in the assembly of the Lord, because of her teshuvah, because of how much she turned to Yahweh, she reached beyond the veil of the law of Torah itself and tapped into Yahweh's chesed, his loving kindness for her. And she was the very one who enabled the lineage of the house of David to come. Think about it. You know, when you go into the New Testament in Matthew's detailed list and his account of Yeshua's lineage, you start looking through that list. And it's very interesting because usually when you're looking through the lineage, very few times in the word do you see the women mentioned. Very, very few times do you see any of the women mentioned. It's all the man's lineage. But in the line of Yeshua, 4 women are explicitly mentioned by name. These women are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Now, what do all these women have in common? They were the outcasts. They were the messy ones. They had complicated pasts. Just go and read about Tamar. Just go read about where Rahab's background came from. Bathsheba, we know about Bathsheba. But they came from being outcasts, the ones that people would look at and say, why would I choose you? You know, especially, I mean, think if you were Yahweh. You need to pick a pure seed, a pure lineage to bring forth the Messiah into Israel. Would you as Yahweh have seen and picked those women? Probably not. If many of us were in Yahweh's place, we probably would have overlooked these women. But they had a heart of repentance. Nobody is beyond Yahweh's saving grace. Nobody is beyond repentance if you just turn back to him. And so all these women became, because of their willingness to follow. You know, Rahab hid the spies. Rahab laid her life on the line to save the people of God. And not only did these women find their place in the people of God, they were placed in the lineage of Messiah himself. You start looking at the people that were in there, Ruth being a Moabite, Rahab coming from the people of Canaan. These are people who they really should not even be in the story. And yet they're in the lineage of David. And there is a phrase that the rabbis say that for David, where did God find him? You know, there's that scripture that in the Psalms where he said, I found my servant David. Where did he find him? In Sodom. Where did the Moabites start? In Sodom with Lot. Okay? The lineage of Moab came out of Sodom, but yet that's where God brought David out of. That's what the lineage of David was. God can purify any lineage. Doesn't matter how sordid of a past someone has. Doesn't matter how much they may have messed up in life. God can still use them. Ruth is the biggest picture of that. And when she goes and she lays down on the threshing floor next to Boaz, and Boaz realizes she's next to him, he calls her a woman of chayil. Now we know that, a woman of valor. The woman of valor in Proverbs 31, it means strong and a virtuous. It means a warrior. So he sees her submitting herself to Naomi. He sees her going ahead and doing everything that Naomi says, and he calls her a warrior. The most strong warriors are those who not only fight through the strongest battles, but are willing to submit themselves to the commander-in-chief. Whatever you say to me, I will do. If you want to be a leader, Yeshua says you must be the servant of all. Ruth displayed that in her entire life. She was one who followed Naomi and submitted herself to her, followed her words to a T, and she ended up getting a new heart, basically. New citizenship, became one of the people of Israel. So she overcame a lot to come to that point. The first word of the 10 Commandments, you can go to read the 10 Commandments. The first word of the 10 Commandments in Hebrew is Anochi, which the Talmud says is an acrostic. It stands for, I, Yahweh, have written myself into this book that I am giving you. So on Mount Sinai, when he was giving them the Torah, he was saying to them basically, I'm writing myself into this book, and I'm giving it to you as a gift. Will you receive it? Will you look for me in this book? Will you find my heart in this book? Will you, like Ruth, say, your people will be my people. Wherever you go, I will go. Whatever you tell me to do, I will do it. I will hear and I will obey. Will you be one who joins to the people of God like that? If you do, the rewards are insurmountable. The rewards are amazing. Ruth had no idea at that point when she was leaving everything behind. She had no idea she would end up in the lineage of Messiah. That was not part of her plan, her thinking. But Yahweh knew. If we follow him, a lot of times we find ourselves in places that we never thought we would be. And so, back to the whole idea of Lot and Sodom, what was Lot's error? What was the error that led to the, led to the Moabites? It was not just the fact that he wasn't serving God. In some ways he was. He was a righteous man in the midst of the wickedness, and his soul was bothered by it. But he wasn't even supposed to be there at that point. What was it that got him to that point? It was the fact that he was not attached to God. He was not clinging to God. What did he do? He left Abraham when he should have stayed. Abraham represented a person who was close to God, and so if you want to be close to God, get close to the people who are close to God. But he left Abraham when he should have stayed. And yet Ruth, his descendant, came back and corrected that mistake by saying, you know what, I want to be close to God, so I'm going to get close to a person that I know is close to God. And she stuck with Naomi through Naomi, and she wasn't moved by Naomi's depression. She wasn't moved by Naomi saying, well, the Lord has done this to me, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, and all this whole. She just stayed faithful to her. She saw inside of her something that Naomi didn't even see inside of herself. That you have something that I want. And the more she clung to Naomi, the more it called out of Naomi who she really was. The wisdom that Naomi had in getting the kinsman redeemer. That tapped into her. She would never have gone down that road of finding the kinsman redeemer had Ruth not been there to call it out. So it went both ways. And this covenant story brought forth so many facets, so many things that it's only Yahweh. You can't say any of these are coincidence. You can't say, oh, it just happened. It's Yahweh. Yahweh has the plan if we will stay with it. And so Ruth seemed like she had everything to lose. You know, she could have thought, part of her could have thought, why go to Israel? You know, you can serve God wherever you are. You know, you've heard the Torah, you've lived with Jewish people. You can, after years of living in this house, you know the Torah. You can live it out wherever you are. But she wanted closeness to God. And so she followed that. Staying in Moab wouldn't have given her that. Romans 8:15 says, "For you have not received the spirit of slavery leading again to fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption, by which we cry, Abba, Father." So let's step into our place of being grafted in tonight and walk it out and find out what lies beyond our obedience to Yahweh. Amen. Well, thank you for those of you who joined us tonight. We trust you've gotten something out of this message. We will see you on Saturday at 11 a.m. Until then, you have a blessed week.